Hi everyone, thank you everyone for this conference and the organizers, Stern and Jocelyn, and people who worked behind the scenes and otherwise. My name is Ayah Aboelela. I'm a PhD student in history at Northeastern University in Boston. Thank you. So my paper is about Mohammed Hassan Ghali, who was the headmaster of a school around Tanta in Egypt. He traveled on the Hijaz railway to Medina around 1912, and he published a travel guide about it in 1914. So I come from a history background, so archaeology is very fascinating to me, but my primary sources are not like excavations or material culture. It's more so the pilgrims' writings, and particularly I'm doing it with this Mohammed Hassan Ghali's guidebook to Medina. So when Ghali published this guidebook, he promised that it would be so comprehensive that anyone wanting to follow his path from Egypt to Medina will, quote, not need to ask anyone anything, unquote. So true to his goal, he provides a lot of information about timetables, lodgings, where to get food, a lot of descriptions of cities and buildings and natural phenomena. So as you can see here, this is a timetable of the train stops between Damascus and Medina. So his guidebook begins with instructions on how to travel by steamship from Egypt, so either from Alexandria or Port Said, to the port of Haifa in Palestine. From there, he travels overland to the Dar'a station in modern-day Syria. Then he switches trains and he boards the Hijaz railway all the way to Medina. He spends several chapters describing his stay in Medina, and then he concludes with his tour of Palestine before returning to Egypt. So my goal in this project is to focus on parts of Ghali's journey that describe his travel by railway. And so by examining his journey as a microhistory and an environmental history, I want to contextualize him and his spirituality within broader intellectual discourses on modernity and technology and religion in the late Ottoman Empire. So to understand his travel guide, we need to know a bit more about who Ghali himself was. Not much is actually known about him besides this publication. I haven't been able to find anything else he published. Still, we can see from the few pages in the author's note and the cover page of his book that he positioned himself in multiple ways. So he positioned himself obviously as a Muslim, a traveler, a pilgrim, a teacher. He was the headmaster of a school in Egypt. He also positioned himself as an Egyptian subject, importantly of the Egyptian Khedive Abbas Pasha II, not the British, who were the effective rulers at the time, technically. He also positions himself as an Ottoman subject, so he often praises Sultan Abdul Hamid II for constructing the Hijaz railway. And also, if you look carefully at the cover of this book, you can see that he actually dedicated half the proceeds to the Ottoman Navy, which was significant at the time, because this was 1914, World War I, and the British were the effective rulers of Egypt, but he was still supporting the Ottomans who were against them. So I would say Ghali was an educated middle-class intellectual, and that's unique because a lot of times the history of Ottoman intellectuals focuses on the elite thinkers and the technocrats and the politicians who had a lot of readership and political influence. It doesn't really focus on people like Ghali, who didn't necessarily have the power to implement his ideas, who didn't necessarily have big audiences, but they nonetheless engaged with these policies and with these big ideas. Ghali is also unique because of his Hajj guidebook, or his travel guidebook to the Hijaz. We all know that Hajj travel writing is obviously a genre that has been around for centuries. But Ghali's is unique because it specifically describes travel along the Hijaz railway, which it was only in operation for a very short amount of time, and we don't have a lot of Muslim-written pieces of writing about it. Another reason he's extraordinary is because he did not travel by the official Egyptian Hajj caravan, which at the time would have traveled by the Red Sea. So Ghali's account is more of a do-it-yourself guide. He provides information on travel logistics that the typical traveler that would have gone with the Egyptian Hajj caravan would not have needed. So his trip was a bit out of the ordinary. So why did Ghali choose this non-conventional route? We might not know his true reasons. He doesn't really elaborate much on it, but it's clear that by designing his own itinerary, he had the flexibility to tour Palestine, which wouldn't have been possible with the official Egyptian caravan, which would have gone through the Red Sea and not have gone through Palestine. So he uses the Hijaz Railway, and that makes it easier. The Hijaz Railway also changed pilgrims' interactions with the environment because they no longer needed to adjust their schedules based on the weather or the location of oases and so on. But that doesn't mean that the Hijaz Railway completely made pilgrims independent of nature. For example, as more pilgrims traveled in the cramped quarters of trains and steamships, instead of the natural, open air quarantines of the desert for weeks, they now had more diseases spreading, so there were more epidemics, and actual quarantine stations needed to be built. So also as pilgrim counts increased to Mecca and Medina, more water, food, fuel was also needed, as well as riding animals to the places that were not accessible by steamship or railway, such as Mecca itself. And in fact, if we look closely at the stations along the Hijaz Railway, we'll notice that many of them were actually along the Syrian Hajj route for centuries beyond, which a few talks have already showed here today. So many of the Hijaz railway stations were actually selected due to their historic role in the Hajj route. They often already had forts and oases and water reserves or other facilities that protected and provided for the Hajj pilgrims in the harsh environment. So even though modern infrastructure was largely constructed in response to environmental limits, it also encountered new limits and highlighted human dependency on nature. So bringing it back to Ghali himself, I want to ask, how did pilgrims' perceptions of the environment change given this new technology, the railway and steamships? This question is not explored too much, and I think it's partly because spirituality is often left out of the historiography, which is all the more surprising since spirituality is what most, if not all, Muslim-authored Hajj travelogues have in common. So the Hajj was a spiritual religious endeavor, and I think because spirituality is laced through so many of the subjects they wrote about, we can use their spiritual commentary to understand their worldviews of different things. So that's what I try to do with Ghali. So he often writes about his spiritual experiences, and they often intersect with his interactions with nature, and that's why an environmental history lens becomes useful. So tracing his journey a bit, he boards the Hijaz railway in Daraa in Syria, and he passes by Yarmouk, and from his train window he witnesses a series of water streams flowing down the mountains, and he drew a diagram of them here. I can't really visualize it. I have a really hard time visualizing what it would look like, but he spends several pages describing it. He was so amazed by these streams along the mountains, and he speaks about them with lots of flowery prose, as you can see here. And it might seem somewhat out of place from a travelogue that is supposedly, it's supposed to give readers information on like Hajj, railway stations and tickets and prices and so on, but it really reflects the tone of the rest of his guidebook because it's factual, it's filled with practical information, but the prose continuously centers God, and whether he discusses other natural phenomena or railway stations, he always uses his observations to invoke his readers' wonder in God and instructing them to center God. But Ghali didn't just credit God, he also credited Sultan Abdul Hamid II for the railway and the new and renovated infrastructure along it. And that's important because to the Ottomans, the pilgrim's mind was sort of an arena where the state competed for authority against the Bedouins, against local Hijazi leaders such as Sharif Hussein and his family who were controlling the Hijaz at the time, as well as European powers who were becoming a growing threat to the Ottoman Empire and especially to the Hijaz since the 1880s and the scramble for Africa. So the Hijaz Railway itself, as well as the quarantine stations and telegraph lines along it, were physical manifestations of Ottoman power, and they were meant to convince the pilgrims of who exactly was in charge. And judging by Ghali's approval of Abd al-Hamid's project and his complete silence on Europeans, he doesn't mention Europe at all, and he very rarely mentions the Bedouins, as we'll see later. The battle for authority over the Hajj, at least in Ghali's mind, favored the Ottomans. So not once does Ghali associate urbanization, technology, development with westernization, or in fact with modernization or modernity. And it's kind of ironic, it might be ironic to us, but to him, he saw this new infrastructure as a way for the region to return to its former glory. And it's not a coincidence that he comments on this at the exact point where he passes by Madain Saleh on the Hijaz Railway. So to him, when he sees that, it invoked images for him of a past with a flourishing desert, with cities, with people who were settled. And the view actually aligns with many of the statesmen and elite Ottomans and Egyptian intellectuals who believed in Ibn Khaldun's theory of cyclical highs and lows. So they believed that by developing the desert and settling the nomads in it and having all this infrastructure, they could promote a revival in the Khaldunian cycle. So where were these nomads, these Bedouins? So Ghali notices a lot of things, but he has a bit of a blind spot. He rarely mentions the Bedouins, and when he does, he otherizes and villainizes them. So, for example, at one point he mentions them in the context of praising the railway employees for preventing any strangers, and particularly Araban, from sneaking onto the train. And this is despite their historic role in Hajj caravans as well as in the construction of the railway. And that's exactly what the Ottoman state wanted. They wanted to veil the Bedouins from the pilgrims' gaze. They wanted to be independent of the Bedouins. They wanted to monopolize the navigation and the safe passage of the desert for themselves. And the Ottomans partially achieved this goal through the Hijaz Railway, so they distanced the Bedouins from the gaze of the pilgrims, and they only made them relevant as far as they were controlled and kept at a distance. So there isn't much scholarship on the views and perspectives of the Bedouins themselves. That's certainly because of a lack of written sources from the Bedouins. But we can see from their multiple attempts at sabotaging the railway, the telegraph line, and their construction, it shows us that they certainly did not approve of these projects the way Ghali and maybe other pilgrims did. So to them, it was a form of imperialism. It was an attempt by a foreign power, the Ottomans, to control them. And these perspectives should not be left out of the narrative because the Bedouins perhaps had the most at stake in the modernization of the Hajj. So back to Ghali. After almost a 2-day journey on the Hijaz Railway, it takes about 48 hours, he finally arrives in Medina. He continues to fulfill his promise of providing a lot of practical details. So he describes the Prophet's mosque, he describes its employees, the various lodgings available, the various markets and restaurants and important sites to visit. But all too soon it was time to leave, so he reboards the Hijaz Railway in Medina. He describes one's emotional state at leaving it. He was very sad, which is kind of relatable. But Ghali did not dwell on his grief for long because it was soon just time to describe the next part of his journey. So he says that many Muslims visit Al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem after visiting the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And he was right. It's uncommon, almost unheard of today, but visiting Jerusalem as part of a journey to Medina and Mecca was very normal. It was a centuries-old tradition among Hajj pilgrims from all over the world, so Central Asia, India, Ottoman Empire. It was very normal for them to come and visit Jerusalem as part of their Hajj, and especially in the 19th century with more steamship routes and railway that really made that more common. So after Ghali left Medina, he got off at the Hijaz Railway's Dar'a stop. he takes another train line to Haifa in Palestine, where he boards a steamship, and he gets off at Jaffa, another city in Palestine. In Jaffa, he obtains a visiting pass, or a jaizat safar, for Jerusalem, and he took another train to get there. He then details Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, and he notes the vines and the olive trees and other fruit trees and the slopes of the mountains, and he advises his readers about the various means of transportation in there, about the lodging. He recommends the Funduq Palestine, or the Palestine Hotel. He lists some various religiously significant places for his Muslim readers, but they're also often significant for Christians and Jews. So he notes them. He notes that they were there as well, that they often visited the same sites together, that they shared the same means of transportation, they lived as neighbors there, they shared businesses, and so on. But this is all remarked in passing. So to Ghali, the two most important things of his visit to Palestine is, one, the convenience of travel between the different cities, and two, their spiritual significance. So the railway and steamship routes and the hotel accommodations and the security of Palestine and the Hijaz, they were all tools that the Ottomans used to assert their authority, but to Ghali, they are what enabled him to tour a spiritual geography centered upon Islamic spirituality and often overlapping with Christian and Jewish pilgrimages in Palestine. So this shows that the Hijaz Railway should not and cannot be studied in isolation. The Hijaz Railway was neither limited to the Hijaz, nor was it disconnected from other railways. It didn't only bring pilgrims to Medina and Mecca, it also brought them to Palestine. And if we even take a top-down perspective, if we look at it from the perspective of the Ottoman state, actually their goals and methods in constructing the Hijaz Railway was often just an extension of their projects that had already been ongoing in Greater Syria. So projects of constructing railways, and as well as Bedouin sedentarization and settlement in Greater Syria. And just as the railway can't be studied in isolation, I think the Hijaz itself, as well as the Hajj as a phenomenon, should not be seen as separate. And today especially, when Palestine is being increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, like in terms of a lot of things, but including like its rights and representations in international law, restrictions on who can and cannot cross Palestine's borders, and the systematic dismantling of the transportation networks within and beyond Palestinian borders since 1948, among many other things. So it's crucial for us to study its centrality historically as a destination of a wide array of itineraries. And one way we can do this is, I think, by following pilgrims' journeys rather than limiting our studies to a particular locale. And actually, a lot of the archaeological studies here have shown this through the material objects that they traced and the trade routes that they would have taken. So it's really fascinating. And I think by doing this, we could reveal various networks of exchanges and the ways that technology and imperialism and individualist spirituality shape them. So clearly there's a lot of work left to be done. Ghali's perspectives need to be compared with other middle-class Egyptians of his time, as well as the Bedouin perspectives that are often left out. But for now, this study is just a micro-history. It follows just one man, a headmaster, an author, and a pilgrim, and it attempts to uncover the ways that modern infrastructure and technology affected his worldviews on the environment, spirituality, and the Hajj experience. And this can eventually open doors for a larger examination of the worldviews of ordinary or extraordinary pilgrims. Thank you.